Full circle. The day Maya unlocked the door to her bakery for the first time, the air itself seemed to hum with possibility. The storefront was modest, tucked between a laundromat and a corner bookstore. Its windows polished until they gleamed and its sign freshly painted with a name she had chosen after many sleepless nights of debate. The Hearth. The word carried everything she wanted her bakery to represent: warmth, home, sustenance, a place where weary souls could rest and be reminded that life still had sweetness in it. As she stepped inside that morning, inhaling the mingling scents of yeast, sugar, and fresh paint, she felt a tremor in her chest. It was not fear, though fear lingered in the background. It was awe. For so long, survival had been her only measure of success. Now, for the first time, she stood in a place built not just for surviving, but for living. Alexander was there, of course, standing near the counter with his arms folded, his blue eyes carrying a quiet pride he rarely expressed aloud. His presence in those early days of the Hearth had been steady but not overbearing. He guided her through the labyrinth of permits, suppliers, and logistics, teaching her how to negotiate contracts, how to price her goods without undervaluing her labor, how to tell the story of her brand in a way that would draw people in. Yet he never tried to claim her vision as his own. He reminded her again and again, "This is your place, Maya, your dream. I am only helping you build the foundation. The rest is yours to carry." And carry it she did, with a determination forged from years of hardship and a heart still tender enough to remember why kindness mattered. The early days of the bakery were far from easy. Some mornings the ovens malfunctioned, forcing her to improvise recipes on the fly. Some days customers trickled in slowly and she fought the fear that no one would come back. There were nights she stayed awake, crunching numbers and wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. But then there were moments that carried her through. An elderly woman who bit into a roll and wept because it reminded her of her childhood. A young couple who declared the Hearth their new Sunday ritual. A construction worker who left a generous tip after saying it was the best bread he'd tasted in years. Each moment was a reminder that her grandmother had been right. Food was never just food. It was memory. It was comfort. It was connection. As weeks turned into months, the Hearth began to thrive. The smell of freshly baked bread spilled out into the street each morning, drawing in passers-by. Regular customers grew into a community, greeting each other in line as though they had known one another for years. Maya hired her first employee, a shy single mother named Rosa who blossomed under Maya's encouragement, and then a second, a teenager who had been on the verge of dropping out of school but found purpose in the bakery's rhythm. Slowly, Maya realized that her dream was not just about bread, but about people. She was creating not just a business, but a place where others could find dignity, stability, and belonging. Through it all, Alexander remained at her side, though his own transformation was just as profound. Helping Maya had restored a part of him that had been shattered by betrayal and loss. He no longer carried himself with the arrogance of a man who once commanded empires. Instead, he carried himself with the humility of someone who understood how quickly empires could crumble. Yet the sharpness of his mind had not dulled. Behind the scenes, he began consulting again, this time choosing projects that aligned with values he had long neglected. Slowly, his name reappeared in circles that had once abandoned him, though now it was whispered with a different kind of respect. Respect for a man who had risen from ruin without bitterness, who had chosen to invest in people rather than power. One chilly evening, nearly a year after the bakery opened, Maya found herself standing behind the counter as the last customers trickled out. The Hearth was quiet now, the chairs stacked, the ovens cooling, the faint golden glow of the lights reflecting in the front windows. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and looked around the space, her heart swelling. This was hers. Every brick, every loaf, every laugh that had echoed within these walls. It all carried her fingerprint. She thought back to the night she had given her last $10 to a stranger, never imagining that single act would lead here. As if summoned by the memory, Alexander stepped through the door, shaking snow from his coat. He looked older than when she had first met him, but also lighter, as though the burden of his past no longer pressed so heavily on him. He walked toward her with that steady gait she had come to rely on, and when he reached the counter, he simply said, "It smells like home in here." Maya smiled, tears pricking her eyes. That's what I wanted. They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, the kind that spoke of shared battles and hard-won victories. Finally, Maya said, her voice soft but steady. Do you ever think about how it all started? That night in the diner? Alexander chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. Every day. You gave me dumplings when I had nothing. And now look at you. You've built something extraordinary. She shook her head. We built it. You believed in me when no one else did. He held her gaze, his blue eyes still carrying that unshakable conviction. No, Maya, you believed in me first. You saw me when I was invisible. Without that, none of this would exist. Her throat tightened, emotion rising. She reached across the counter and clasped his hand, their fingers curling together, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had endured. In that moment, the circle was complete. The waitress who once gave her last $10 to feed a stranger had become the woman who now fed an entire community. And the broken man who once sat in silence at a booth had become the mentor and partner who helped her rise. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and quiet, blanketing the city in white. But inside the hearth there was warmth, an enduring warmth that no storm could extinguish. And in that warmth, Maya knew one unshakable truth. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness plant the seeds of transformation, and when nurtured with courage, those seeds can grow into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. She had come full circle. Transformation. The weeks that followed were nothing short of overwhelming for Maya. Life had never given her the luxury of easing into change. It always threw her straight into the fire. Alexander's offer had lingered in her mind until she finally gave him the hesitant yes he had been waiting for, though the word left her lips more like a whisper than a declaration. She had not shouted her decision with confidence, but the simple act of saying yes changed the trajectory of her days. Alexander moved quickly as though he had been waiting for the chance to act. His world might have been stripped from him, but the skills that had once built empires had not left him. With each passing day, he began teaching Maya how to see life differently, not through the lens of desperation, but through the lens of possibility. The first lessons were not about business at all. Alexander insisted that before she could build anything, she had to transform her thinking. You've lived so long in survival mode, he told her one evening as they sat in the diner's corner booth after hours. That mode sharpens you, but it also cages you. It convinces you that scraps are the best you'll ever get. If you're going to lead something, even something as small as a bakery, you have to break that mindset. You have to learn to think bigger. Maya bristled at first. Thinking bigger felt like daydreaming, and daydreaming had always been dangerous for her. It opened the door to disappointment. But Alexander was relentless. He gave her books to read, biographies of leaders who had risen from nothing, essays on resilience, even cookbooks with introductions that spoke about food as culture, food as story, food as a bridge between people. She devoured the words at night after her shifts, her mind aching with exhaustion but also ignited with something new, curiosity. It had been years since she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond the next paycheck, but slowly, she felt her perspective widening. Still, transformation was not easy. For every moment of inspiration, there were just as many moments of self-doubt. When Alexander pushed her to sketch out her vision for the bakery, what it would look like, how it would feel, the kind of customer she wanted to serve, Maya froze. Her pen hovered over the paper and her hand began to shake. I don't know how to do this, she confessed, frustration rising in her throat. I'm not a planner, I just survive. Alexander reached across the table, steadying the notebook with his hand. You don't have to know how to do everything today. Just start. Draw the door. Draw the window. Write the smell you want people to notice when they walk in. That's enough for now. His voice was patient, grounding, and for the first time, Maya realized that transformation didn't happen in grand leaps, but in small, consistent steps. Outside the diner, her trials continued to press on her. The landlord still hovered, eager to evict her. Her brother called in tears after receiving another tuition bill he couldn't pay, and her coworkers, especially Carla, eyed her strangely when she began spending more time with Alexander, whispering that she must be naive to trust a man like him. But even in the midst of those doubts, something within her had begun to shift. Instead of letting the weight of each challenge crush her, she began asking, how can I solve this? What can I do differently? It was a subtle change, but it gave her back a sense of agency she hadn't felt in years. Alexander, too, was undergoing his own transformation, though he did not speak of it often. Watching Maya take small steps toward her dream stirred something in him that had been dormant since his empire collapsed. He had once measured his worth by numbers on a screen, stock prices rising and falling like tides. But here, in this modest diner with a waitress who had given him dumplings when he had nothing, he discovered a different kind of wealth, the wealth of purpose. Helping Maya rebuild her life reminded him of who he had been before greed and betrayal consumed him. It reawakened the builder inside him, the man who once believed that creation was more powerful than destruction. Together they began meeting outside the diner, usually in the evenings when her shifts ended. They would sit in libraries or coffee shops, Maya scribbling nervously in her notebook while Alexander guided her through the basics of budgeting, planning, and storytelling. "A bakery isn't just about bread," he explained one night, his blue eyes alive with intensity. "It's about what the bread represents. Your grandmother didn't just feed people, she gave them a sense of home, a sense of belonging. That's your brand. That's what people will pay for. Not just flour and sugar, but the feeling of being seen, of being cared for." Maya listened, spellbound, realizing that he was teaching her not just how to build a business, but how to build a vision. And though she still wrestled with doubts about her abilities, about his past, about whether this dream was truly possible, she could not deny that the ground beneath her was shifting. She was no longer just a waitress scraping tips together. She was becoming something more, though the shape of it was still forming. The turning point came one evening when Alexander handed her a small envelope. Inside was a check, not extravagant, but enough to cover her overdue rent and buy her a few weeks of breathing space. Maya's first instinct was to refuse it, pride rising like a shield. But Alexander shook his head before she could protest. "This isn't charity. It's seed money, an investment in your stability, so you can focus on building instead of drowning. Take it." Her hands trembled as she held the envelope. Tears stung her eyes, not from the amount itself, but from what it represented. For the first time in years, someone believed in her enough to invest not in what she was, but in what she could become. And that belief was worth more than any dollar amount. That night, lying awake in her apartment, Maya pressed the envelope to her chest and allowed herself to cry. Not tears of despair, but tears of release. For the first time in so long, she felt the faint but undeniable pull of transformation. She was still afraid, still unsure, still carrying scars from years of hardship. But now she had a partner, a mentor, and most importantly, a reason to hope. The path ahead would be grueling. There would be failures, setbacks, and more trials than she could count. But as she drifted toward sleep, one thought anchored her. She was no longer trapped in survival. She was learning how to live, and that was the beginning of everything. Trials and doubts. Maya lay awake that night, staring at the cracked ceiling of her apartment as the radiator clicked and hissed in the corner. Alexander's words replayed in her mind, circling endlessly like a haunting refrain. "All I need from you is the courage to say yes." It had been easy to shrug off grand promises in the past. After all, she had heard her share of them from people who never followed through. Friends who swore they would pay her back, managers who promised raises that never came, a father who had once promised stability before disappearing altogether. Life had taught her not to lean on words, but to measure people by their actions. And yet when Alexander spoke, something inside her wanted desperately to believe him. She had seen the sincerity in his eyes, had felt the authority in his presence, the quiet assurance of someone who had known both power and loss. Still, belief was dangerous. It had the power to lift her only to let her fall harder. The next morning she rose before dawn, exhaustion pulling at her body but determination forcing her forward. She brewed the last scoop of coffee grounds in her cupboard, letting the bitter taste jolt her into focus. As she sipped from a chipped mug, she tried to map out the reality of what Alexander's offer meant. A bakery wasn't just ovens and flour. It was rent, permits, suppliers, staff, endless expenses she could not begin to cover. Even if he was serious, even if he had the resources to help, what if she failed? What if she took everything he offered and still collapsed under the weight of it? Her grandmother had always told her that pride was no meal, but neither was failure. The thought of losing what little she already had terrified her. When she arrived at the diner later that morning, Alexander was already there. He sat in his usual booth sipping tea, though his posture was different. He seemed more awake, more present, as though the fog that had cloaked him in previous weeks had begun to lift. He greeted her with a quiet nod, and for the first hour of her shift they exchanged only polite words. But eventually he leaned forward and asked in that steady voice, "Have you thought about what I said?" Maya set down the coffee pot she was holding and met his gaze. "I have, and I don't know if I can do it. I don't even know if I can trust you." Alexander did not flinch. Instead, he nodded slowly as though he had expected her doubts. "Good," he said. "You shouldn't trust easily. The world is full of people who will take more than they give. But Maya, trust isn't about knowing the ending. It's about deciding who you're willing to build the beginning with." The words unsettled her, not because they were untrue, but because they sounded like something her grandmother would have said. Measured, wise, deceptively simple. She felt her defenses weaken, though not collapse. "You still haven't told me who you really are," she challenged. For a long moment he said nothing, his eyes locked on hers. Then he leaned back as though weighing how much to reveal. "My name is Alexander Grant," he said finally. "I used to run a company that most people thought was unstoppable. For a while it was, until it wasn't. I trusted the wrong people, and when it all came crashing down, I lost more than money. I lost my name, my friends, my family, everything." He exhaled, his voice roughened by memory. "I've been walking through the wreckage ever since. Until you." Maya's heart pounded. The name sounded faintly familiar, though she couldn't place it. Somewhere in the back of her mind she thought she remembered a headline, a scandal, but she didn't press. What mattered wasn't the weight of his past empire, but the rawness of his confession. For the first time she realized that the man sitting across from her wasn't just some drifter. He had once stood at heights she could hardly imagine. That made his presence here in this diner all the more jarring, but knowing his truth did not erase her doubts. If anything, it complicated them. If he really was who he said he was, why choose her? Why invest in her dream when he could rebuild his own life instead? And what if his fall from grace had left scars deeper than he admitted? Could she risk tethering her fragile future to someone whose own foundation had crumbled? As the days passed, the weight of the decision pressed harder. Maya found herself pulled in two directions. On one side was the voice of fear, whispering that it was safer to stay where she was. The diner might not pay much, but it was steady, predictable. Better to cling to survival than reach for something greater and risk losing everything. On the other side was the voice of hope, quieter but persistent, reminding her of warm kitchens, the smell of her grandmother's bread, the vision of a place she could call her own. She caught herself sketching bakery names in the margins of her order pad, imagining window displays filled with pastries, imagining customers smiling as they left with boxes tied in string. Dreams she thought had died began creeping back into her mind, stubborn and alive. But dreams alone were not enough. The first true trial came when her landlord arrived at her apartment one evening, pounding on the door with a fist heavy enough to shake the hinges. When Maya opened it, he thrust a notice into her hand. "You're 2 weeks behind, Williams," he barked. 2 weeks. I want payment by Friday or you're out. So excuses this time. His eyes were cold, his voice sharper than usual. "I've given you enough chances. Pay or pack." Then he turned and stomped down the hall, leaving her clutching the paper with trembling hands. She sank onto the couch, tears stinging her eyes. The reality was undeniable. She did not have the money. Even if she worked extra shifts, even if she borrowed from her brother, it wouldn't be enough. For the first time, the ground beneath her survival cracked wide open, and she saw how close she was to losing everything. That night, she met Alexander again at the diner, unable to hide the weight of the notice she carried in her bag. He saw it in her face immediately, the way her usual resilience sagged under the burden. Without asking, he said, "You're running out of time, aren't you?" She wanted to deny it, but the words caught in her throat. He reached across the table, not touching her hand, but resting his palm flat against the surface as though placing an anchor there. "Maya, trials will come whether you choose to change your life or not. You can suffer for a paycheck that barely keeps you alive, or you can suffer building something that might actually give you freedom. Either way, life will test you. The difference is what you're fighting for." Her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. He was right, and that truth cut deeper than any comfort could. The trials were already here. The doubts were already suffocating her. And perhaps the only way out was through the risk, through the fear, through the choice to believe in something bigger than survival. That night, as she lay once again staring at the ceiling, Maya realized that saying yes would not erase her struggles. If anything, it would magnify them, forcing her to face challenges she had never encountered before. But she also realized something more powerful. Saying no would mean surrendering to a life that had already begun to break her spirit. And so, though the trials pressed hard and the doubts screamed louder than ever, a seed of resolve began to take root. She would not let fear dictate her story forever. The offer, the diner, had become a kind of sanctuary for Alexander, though he never said it aloud. Its cracked vinyl booths and flickering fluorescent lights were far from the luxurious dining rooms he had once frequented, but there was safety in its ordinariness. The hum of the refrigerator, the steady rhythm of orders being called back to the kitchen, and the aroma of frying bacon gave him a grounding he had not felt in months. Most importantly, it was the place where Maya worked, and each day he returned. It was less about the food or the tea and more about watching her move between tables with quiet determination, carrying far more weight on her shoulders than most people could imagine. He found himself drawn to her resilience. She did not complain, did not indulge in self-pity, and did not treat kindness as a commodity to be rationed out only when convenient. She gave freely, even when she had nothing, and that fascinated him. Over the days and weeks that followed, Alexander began piecing together fragments of her life. He overheard her landlord's sharp voice on the phone when she stepped outside during her break. He saw the fatigue etched into her face after double shifts that stretched past midnight. He caught snippets of conversations with Carla, who sometimes softened enough to ask about Maya's younger brother, a college student struggling to stay enrolled after financial aid had fallen through. Maya did not offer these details to him directly, but Alexander had always been a man who noticed what others overlooked. In another life, he had made billions from that very skill, identifying the gaps in markets, the opportunities hidden in plain sight. Now he was noticing the gaps in her life, the ways she was barely holding it together, and he felt a surge of something he had not allowed himself in a long time: purpose. One evening, after the last customer left and Carla had gone home, Maya was wiping down the counters when Alexander remained seated in his booth, instead of slipping quietly out into the night. He watched her for a long moment, gathering the courage to break the silence. Finally, he said, "Maya, have you ever thought about what you would do if money wasn't the thing keeping you trapped here?" She paused mid-wipe, frowning slightly at the strange question. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he continued carefully, "if you didn't have to worry about bills, rent, or whether your car has enough gas to get you to work, what would you do with your life?" "What's the thing you dream about when no one's looking?" Maya let out a short laugh, though it held no real humor. "Dreams are expensive. I stopped thinking about them a long time ago." "Humor me." Alexander pressed, his tone gentle but insistent. She hesitated, her cloth still resting on the counter. For a long moment she said nothing, then finally admitted, "I used to want to open a bakery. Nothing fancy. Just a small place where people could come in and feel at home, the way my grandmother made me feel in her kitchen. She used to bake bread that could make the whole block smell like warmth and safety. I thought if I could give that feeling to people, maybe it would mean something." Her cheeks flushed, embarrassed at revealing so much. "But that's just a kid's dream. Life doesn't really work like that." Alexander leaned forward, his eyes intense. "It can. You're wrong to think otherwise." His certainty startled her. "How would you know?" For the first time since they met, Alexander gave her a piece of his truth. "Because once I built something out of nothing, too. And I lost it. But I know what it takes to build again." Maya stared at him, unsure whether to believe him or dismiss it as the ramblings of a man who still wore the same coat every day. Yet there was conviction in his voice, a steadiness that didn't sound like fantasy. He spoke like someone who knew what it meant to climb mountains and to fall from them. He took a deep breath and then made the words that had been burning in his chest real. "Maya, let me help you. Let me invest in you." Her rag dropped onto the counter. "What?" "I'm serious," he said firmly. "You gave me something when I had nothing. Not just food, but dignity. You saw me when I was invisible. And I can't keep taking without giving back. You want a bakery? Let me give you the chance to make it real." Maya's first instinct was to laugh it off. The idea seemed absurd. A struggling waitress being offered an investment by a man she thought was barely scraping by himself. "You can't even afford a meal," she blurted before she could stop herself. A shadow of a smile tugged at Alexander's lips. "That's what you think. But you don't really know me, Maya, not yet. What you see isn't all that I am. I may have lost the life I had, but I didn't lose who I am. I still know how to create opportunity, and I want to start with you." Maya felt her pulse quicken. Part of her wanted to believe him, to let his certainty wash over her like hope. But another part of her, hardened by years of disappointments, bristled at the possibility of false promises. "Why me?" she asked quietly. His gaze softened. "Because you're the kind of person the world overlooks but shouldn't. Because you've proven that even with nothing you still choose kindness. That's rare, Maya, and I think it deserves to be rewarded." The silence that followed was thick with possibility. Maya's mind spun with conflicting thoughts. Suspicion, fear, curiosity, and a dangerous flicker of hope she had tried so hard to bury. Could it be true? Could this man who appeared broken be the one to open a door she thought had been sealed forever? Finally, she shook her head, grounding herself. "Even if you mean what you say, I wouldn't know where to start. I don't have the training, the money, the connections. Dreams are one thing, but reality..." Her voice trailed off. Alexander stood then, the first time she'd seen him rise with the full height and authority of who he once had been. His shoulders straightened, his presence filling the small diner as if he belonged in rooms far larger than this. His blue eyes locked onto hers with a fire she hadn't seen before. "Reality is exactly what I know how to shape. I'm offering you more than money, Maya. I'm offering mentorship, partnership, a chance to build something lasting. All I need from you is the courage to say yes." Her breath caught. For a moment, it felt as though the diner itself held its breath with her, the hum of the refrigerator fading, the fluorescent lights buzzing into silence. The world seemed to shrink down to the space between his words and her decision. Maya swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to say yes, desperately, but the years of scraping by made it hard to trust in miracles. And yet, looking into Alexander's eyes, she saw no deception, no pity, only conviction. And that was the moment she realized her life was on the edge of changing forever. Ripples of kindness. The storm had finally begun to ease, though its remnants still weighed heavily on the city. Icy drifts piled against curbs. Cars sat frozen under layers of white, and sidewalks became treacherous sheets of compacted snow. For most people, the end of a storm signaled relief, but for Maya it meant the start of new challenges. Customers who tipped less because of the weather, late-night shifts that ended with her walking home in the cold, and a landlord who seemed to knock louder on her door each month when rent was due. Life was a storm of its own for her, relentless and unpredictable. Yet in the quiet moments she found herself thinking of Alexander, though she still did not know his name. He had returned each day since she'd first offered him dumplings, never ordering much, often sitting in silence, and always watching her with that steady, unnerving gaze that seemed to pierce beyond the surface. She had learned not to flinch under it, though inside she wondered what he was searching for in her face. At first, Carla had mocked the situation mercilessly, calling Maya Mother Teresa with an apron, and suggesting she must have some savior complex. But soon even Carla seemed to grow uneasy under Alexander's presence. There was something about him that defied the usual assumptions one might make about a man in worn clothes, something that made mockery ring hollow. His posture carried dignity despite the weariness in his body, and his manner of speaking, when he did speak, was articulate, precise, as if every word was weighed before it was released. Customers began noticing, too. An old man who came in for coffee one morning offered Alexander half his bagel without being asked. A teenager left a donut on his table before hurrying off to school. It was as if Maya's single act of kindness had rippled outward, stirring something dormant in the hearts of others. Maya did not see herself as the center of any ripple. To her, she was still the same woman hustling double shifts, patching holes in her sneakers and trying to stretch groceries into meals. But the truth was that her choice had shifted the atmosphere of the diner. Where once there had been only weary customers, now there was a subtle current of generosity. Even Carla, whose sarcasm had been relentless, began leaving extra packets of sugar on Alexander's table, though she rolled her eyes while doing it. People were watching, and kindness was catching. For Alexander, each of these gestures was almost unbearable. He had spent years believing in markets, in numbers, in cold calculations where worth was measured by profit margins and quarterly gains. Acts of kindness had been tools in his world, strategic moves wrapped in smiles to gain influence or loyalty. But these small, uncalculated gestures, dumplings, bagels, donuts, sugar packets, held no ulterior motives. They were pure in a way he had forgotten existed, and they began to unravel something inside him. One evening, after most of the customers had gone and the diner was quiet, he finally spoke more than a sentence to Maya. She was refilling the ketchup bottles when he cleared his throat and said, "You remind me of someone I used to know." She glanced up, curious but cautious. "Who?" she asked. He stared into his tea for a long moment before answering. "My mother. She never had much, but she had this way of giving like it was in her nature. She used to say that when you give, you're not losing something, you're planting something. I didn't understand that when I was younger. I thought giving made you weak. But now," his voice trailed off and his eyes glistened briefly before he blinked it away. Maya said nothing, but something in her chest tightened. She had not expected such vulnerability from him. She wanted to ask questions. Where was his mother now? What had happened to him? Why was he really here? But she sensed he wasn't ready to unravel his story yet. Instead, she offered the simplest reply. "She sounds like a wise woman." Alexander nodded, the faintest smile ghosting across his lips. She was. What Maya did not know was that in confessing even that small fragment, Alexander had taken a step he hadn't taken with anyone in years. He had built walls around his heart so high and thick that even he had forgotten what lay on the other side. But the walls were beginning to crack, not under the force of interrogation or pity, but under the quiet persistence of kindness. Meanwhile, Maya's own life pressed on with its usual weight. Her landlord left another notice taped to her door, this one with the word "final" scrawled across it in red. Her younger brother, whom she had practically raised after their parents' deaths, called to ask for money she did not have. And her manager at the diner reminded her that hours might be cut next month if business didn't pick up. She carried all of it silently, wearing her smile like armor as she worked. She did not tell Alexander about her troubles, just as he did not yet tell her about his. But he noticed. He noticed the tired slump of her shoulders when she thought no one was looking, the way she pressed her lips together when she counted her tips at night, the quiet sighs she tried to disguise as yawns. He noticed, and it unsettled him. For a man who had once commanded empires, it was a strange sensation to feel powerless in the face of one woman's struggle. Yet at the same time, it ignited something he thought had been lost forever, the desire to build, to protect, to create opportunities where none seemed possible. Her act of giving dumplings had lit a spark in him, and that spark was beginning to grow into a flame. One night, unable to sleep, Alexander wandered through the city streets, the cold biting at his cheeks. He thought about all the people he had once known, investors who pretended to be friends, colleagues who turned enemies, acquaintances who vanished the moment his empire crumbled. None of them had given him what Maya had. None of them had offered kindness without expectation. And he realized then that perhaps he had been given a second chance, not by luck or fate, but by a waitress with nothing but $10 to her name who had chosen compassion over survival. He stopped under a flickering streetlight, his breath clouding in the frozen air. For the first time in months, maybe years, he whispered a vow to himself. He would not waste this chance. Maya might think she had saved him with a plate of dumplings, but he knew better. She had given him more than food. She had given him a reason to start again. And though he had not yet told her, Alexander Grant still carried knowledge, skills, and connections that could reshape lives. He had been a billionaire once, and though stripped of his wealth, he had not lost his mind, his vision, or his capacity to rebuild. He would start with her. He would make sure Maya Williams would never again have to choose between feeding herself and feeding someone else. The ripples of kindness had already begun, but Alexander was preparing for the wave. The stranger's secret. The snowstorm did not let up through the night, burying Southside Chicago in a thick blanket of white that muffled the usual noises of the streets. By the time dawn arrived, the city looked both peaceful and desolate, a strange balance between beauty and struggle. Maya awoke in her tiny apartment, the old radiator rattling like a tired drum in the corner, barely keeping the chill at bay. She wrapped herself in her thin blanket for a moment longer, listening to the quiet before pushing herself out of bed. The weight of reality was waiting for her the second her feet touched the cold floorboards. Overdue bills stacked on the table, half a gallon of milk in the fridge, and nothing but 2 slices of bread left in the cupboard. She knew she needed to stretch her resources as far as possible, and her plan was simple. Make it through today, then tomorrow, then the next day. That was how she had been surviving for months, stringing together little acts of endurance until they formed something that could pass for a life. Still, even in her fatigue, the memory of the man in the diner lingered in her mind. She had replayed his expression more than once. The disbelief when she set the food down, the way his hands trembled when he reached for the dumplings, and that single tear that had escaped despite his effort to hide it. Maya had seen many customers in her years as a waitress, loud ones, kind ones, rude ones, drunk ones, but she had never forgotten how someone looked when they were truly hungry. Hunger did not just shrink the body. It hollowed the eyes, bent the posture, and pressed down on the soul. That man had looked like someone who had been carrying not just hunger, but also grief and loss, as though the world had stripped him of more than food. She had helped him in the smallest way she could, but she had gone to bed wondering if he had anywhere to stay, or if he was still in that booth long after she left. Unbeknownst to her, the man had not left right away. He had sat in that booth long after the diner closed, his hands wrapped around the last of the ginger tea as though the styrofoam cup itself carried warmth straight into his bones. He had once lived a life of abundance, where ginger tea was served in porcelain cups and dumplings arrived on gleaming plates in high-rise restaurants. But those meals had never tasted the way these did. Those meals had been transactions, business dinners filled with empty promises and carefully rehearsed smiles. These dumplings, humble and steaming, tasted of grace. He had whispered the word to himself when he finished the last bite. Grace. And then he sat there, staring out at the storm, remembering how far he had fallen. His name was Alexander Grant, though he had not spoken it aloud to anyone in weeks. Once the name had carried weight. It had been printed in glossy magazines, whispered in financial circles, and attached to companies that shaped industries. He had been called many things: visionary, ruthless, brilliant, arrogant. He had built an empire in technology before most people even understood what kind of power technology could wield. He had lived in penthouses, flown private, and signed checks that changed the lives of those around him. And yet, despite all of it, here he was, reduced to a man who could not even buy himself a plate of dumplings. The collapse had not been sudden, though it had felt that way when it finally happened. It had begun with a betrayal, a partner he trusted who siphoned resources, leaving cracks in the empire. Then came the lawsuits, the investigations, the vultures circling overhead. The media, once flattering, had turned vicious, calling him a fraud before any verdict was even reached. Investors who toasted to him in golden ballrooms one month abandoned him the next. Friends disappeared. Even family became distant, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. By the time the smoke cleared, he was left with almost nothing. His accounts were frozen, his reputation shredded, and the people he thought would stand beside him had vanished like mist. Pride had kept him silent at first, refusing to reach out for help. But silence had turned into isolation, and isolation had turned into nights on benches, days wandering streets, and a slow erosion of the man he once was. It was in that broken state that Maya's kindness had found him. A single act that seemed small, a waitress buying dumplings for a stranger, but it pierced deeper than she could know. For Alexander, it wasn't about the food alone. It was the fact that someone had seen him not as a failure, not as a headline, not as a burden, but simply as a human being worthy of compassion. He had nearly forgotten what that felt like. The next morning, as Maya trudged through the snow on her way back to the diner for another shift, she pushed thoughts of him aside. She told herself she had enough of her own problems to carry. She couldn't afford to wonder about strangers she would probably never see again. But fate, as it often does in stories of transformation, had other plans. When she stepped into the diner, shaking the snow from her hair, she froze. There he was again, sitting in the same booth, his blue eyes lifting toward her as if he had been waiting all night for her return. For a moment she thought she must be imagining it. Then her chest tightened. He looked a little less ghostly than yesterday, though still weary. His coat buttoned to his neck, his posture straighter. But it was his gaze that held her, steady, searching, almost too intense. She quickly slipped behind the counter, hiding the surprise in her voice as she said, "You're back." He nodded. "I wanted to thank you." His voice was stronger today, though still edged with the gravel of exhaustion. You didn't have to do what you did yesterday. Maya shrugged, trying to make it casual. You were hungry. It was nothing. But Alexander shook his head. It wasn't nothing. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Most people would have walked away. Most people have walked away. His words carried more weight than she could fully understand, but something in his tone made her realize this man carried secrets larger than hunger. Carla rolled her eyes from the other end of the counter, muttering under her breath about feeding strays again. Maya ignored her, but Alexander's gaze flickered toward Carla and then back to Maya. Sharp and observant. May I ask your name? He said quietly. Maya, she answered after a pause. Maya, he repeated, as though testing the sound of it on his tongue. A slow, almost reluctant smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. That's a good name. Means illusion in Sanskrit, doesn't it? But there's nothing illusionary about you. The way he said it unsettled her slightly, though not in a threatening way, more in the way of someone who looked at her as though she were far more significant than she believed herself to be. And in that moment, Maya realized something she could not explain. This man was not who he appeared to be. He might look broken and worn, but there was a gravity about him, a presence she couldn't place. He was hiding something, a story, a history, maybe even a destiny. And though she had no way of knowing yet, her life was about to be pulled into it in ways that would change her forever. The empty purse Maya Williams pressed her hand against the lining of her worn-out coat pocket. The fabric was thin from years of use, the seams fraying where her fingers rubbed. She felt the crinkle of paper, her last $10 bill, folded 3 times over as if being smaller might make it easier to ignore. Her stomach growled, a low rumble that reminded her she hadn't eaten since last night's shift. It wasn't the first time she'd gone hungry to stretch what little she had, but tonight felt heavier. Rent was due in 3 days. Her electricity bill had a bright orange warning notice taped across it, and her gas tank needle hovered just above E. She whispered to herself like a prayer, just a few more days. Hold it together a few more days. The diner was nearly empty, the way it always got after the lunchtime rush in Southside Chicago. The snowstorm outside had chased away the last stragglers, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator and the faint clatter of utensils from the back kitchen. Maya adjusted the strap of her apron and leaned against the counter, trying not to think about how long it would take her to get home through the storm. She told herself the $10 in her pocket was for dinner and gas, fuel for her body, fuel for her car, fuel to keep going. But she also knew how easily that plan could unravel. The stranger, the bell above the diner door jingled, startling her. Cold wind rushed in with a man who looked like he'd been carved out of the storm itself. His coat hung loosely from his shoulders, snow dusting the shoulders, his beard uneven and wet from melted flakes. He moved like someone carrying a heavy invisible weight, every step deliberate and slow. Maya's instinct as a waitress was automatic. Straighten up, smile, welcome. But the man didn't look toward her. He kept his gaze low, his boots squeaking on the linoleum. He slid into the corner booth, his posture collapsing against the vinyl seat. When Maya approached, pad in hand, he lifted his eyes. They were startlingly blue, sharp even in their exhaustion. His lips parted as though he wanted to speak, but only a hoarse whisper came out. I don't have any money. The words hung between them, carried by the silence of the empty diner. Maya blinked, her training telling her she should politely nod and move on. But she didn't. She stood there, pen hovering over the blank page of her order pad. Something in his voice, a raw honesty, hit her chest like a stone. This wasn't the slick manipulation of someone trying to score a free meal. This was naked, stripped-down truth. For a long moment, she just looked at him. He looked away first, ashamed. The choice Maya returned to the counter. Carla, her coworker, was counting tips and scrolling through her phone at the same time. She hadn't noticed the man, or maybe she had and chose not to care. Maya's hand went back into her pocket, curling around the $10 bill. She felt the edges press into her fingertips, reminding her of everything it meant: dinner, gas, survival. She closed her eyes. No, it ain't much, but a warm dumpling beats cold pride. Her grandmother's words came back like an echo from years ago, spoken over steaming pots in their old kitchen before the world had collapsed around them. Maya opened her eyes, smoothed the bill against the counter, and walked toward the register. A few minutes later, She set a takeout box on the man's table. Inside were 2 pork dumplings still steaming and a styrofoam cup filled with ginger tea. The man's eyes widened in disbelief. He hesitated as if afraid the box would vanish if he touched it. But when he opened it, the scent of ginger and pork rose into the air, and something fragile flickered across his face. He picked up 1 dumpling, brought it to his mouth, and chewed slowly. His eyes fluttered shut, and for the first time since he'd entered, the tightness in his jaw softened. Maya turned away, pretending to wipe the counter, but she caught the faintest sound, a soft, broken exhale. A tear rolled down his cheek. Carla's cruelty behind her. Carla burst into laughter. "Would you look at that? Little Miss Charity over here buying dumplings for Mr. Homeless Tears." Maya's spine stiffened. She didn't turn around, just kept wiping the same spot on the counter. "He said he had no money," Carla went on, her voice sharp with mockery. "And you? You give him your last $10 like it's some fairy tale? You ever think maybe people like him end up in the gutter because they put themselves there?" Maya turned slowly. Her eyes met Carla's with a calm steadiness that belied the storm inside her. "And maybe," she said evenly, "people stay in the gutter because folks like you step on them instead of helping them out." Carla blinked, caught off guard by the fierceness in Maya's tone. For once she had no comeback. Maya didn't wait for one. She turned back toward the booth, grabbed a rag, and began wiping down the table nearby, her movements calm but deliberate. The man watched her silently. He'd seen many things in life: polished lies in ballrooms, ruthless games in boardrooms, smiles masking daggers at family dinners. But in this flickering diner under buzzing fluorescent lights, he saw something rare, real kindness, and it wrecked him. The man ate slowly, savoring each bite like it was both gift and memory. His mind drifted unbidden to days when food like this was just another line item on a corporate lunch tab. He'd known power, wealth, influence, until he hadn't. Until betrayal had stripped him of the trappings and left him standing in the snow, searching for shelter in forgotten diners. He wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve, embarrassed by the tears that still threatened at the corners of his eyes. Get a grip, he told himself. But it was no use. Kindness felt like a foreign language, one he'd forgotten how to speak. He looked at the waitress again. Her uniform was clean but faded, her shoes scuffed, her hair tied back in a messy bun. She wasn't doing this for praise or pity. She simply saw him. That was enough to undo him more than any fortune lost. Section 6. Closing time. Snow pressed harder against the windows as evening deepened. Maya's shift drew to a close. She untied her apron, hung it behind the counter, and slipped her coat over her shoulders. As she passed the man's booth, she paused. "Take your time. Stay warm as long as you need," she said softly. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. He only nodded, blue eyes shining in a way that made her throat tighten. Maya stepped out into the storm. The cold bit instantly at her cheeks, but there was a warmth inside her chest, small but steady. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Rent, bills, hunger, but tonight she knew she'd made the right choice. Because cold pride never filled anyone's belly.